William Quantrill came from Ohio to the territory of Kansas, where he worked as a school teacher, and then ultimately, and it's a little unclear. I mean, he tells a story that is probably a little bit self-serving, and it's not entirely clear to historians why he changed his stripes, so to speak. He initially was working with Jayhawkers, and then ultimately he ends up becoming one of the most notorious secessionist guerrilla leaders in Missouri. And with a lot of these guys, it's not clear as to what their motivations were for what they did. For some, of course, their fathers, mostly because because the guerrillas were mostly young men, 16 to maybe 25 years old. So in some cases, their fathers were property owners. They may have owned slaves, and there's some recent research to show that that one motivating factor may have been that that their fathers most likely had lost some of their land. There had been a financial scheme, essentially, in the early years of the war to arm secessionist forces, and this was a scheme that was led by the governor, Claiborne Fox Jackson, of the state of Missouri, who wanted to take Missouri out of the Union and wanted for Missouri to join the South. And he wanted to organize some militia units, but he had to finance it, and his belief was that once Missouri was taken out of the Union, that then the Confederacy would reimburse them for the people who had helped to fund this for their expenses. But in the meanwhile, they had to have the money. So what they did was people took out loans from local Missouri banks, who mostly were run by people who were pro-Southern, and they financed and the equipping these militia units. But then, of course, what happens is Missouri does not leave the Union, and the Union Army rolls over the state of Missouri, takes possession of those banks, basically, and kicks out the pro-Southern people who were in charge of them, and people were never repaid. In fact, the banks start to call in the loans on these men who had financed this venture, and ultimately, many of them had put up land as collateral, and they lost some of their land. So that was happening. The presence of the Union Army ended up being a magnet for slaves. They ran away oftentimes to these Union military encampments, so people were losing their slaves, and all of this likely fueled young men to join these guerrilla units. They could have, of course, joined the regular Confederate Army, but the closest regular Confederate Army was in Arkansas, and so they were concerned with protecting their own households and their own property, or their parents' property, and so they stayed here and basically went to the bush. Quantrill, none of that was true for him, but yet he was swept up in this anyway, and it's really hard to know what made him tick. I mean, there's a story he tells of this Morgan Walker raid, and that was the point at which he sort of switched sides, that he came in as a guerrilla, as a Jayhawker, but then he informed the people that they were going to raid of their property, including their slaves, that he turned on his fellow Jayhawkers and basically sold them out, and many of them were killed in this raid, and that it's at that point that he switched sides, but it's unclear as to exactly what his motivation. He tells some story about a brother that was killed, but that brother never existed. I mean, it's curious.